Okay, hello everyone. It is officially chapter 13. So we're going to be talking about the spinal cord and spinal nerves. This lecture will be for this Thursday. We will not be having class on Tuesday. It is officially the day to go exercise your right to vote, so we won't be meeting that day. Okay, so just make sure that you're staying on top of everything. First, you have your study aid questions for chapter 13. Your quiz is due by midnight Friday. Make sure you also have finished your adaptive practice for chapter 14, due next Monday. In terms of your study guide questions, hopefully throughout the course of this lecture, we'll kind of hit upon the answers for all of these particular study guide questions. Okay, so the overall arching kind of purpose of this is to talk about the spinal cord and its function in the human body. So not surprisingly, one of the main functions of that is to, identify some of the anatomical features of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. We'll also discuss some of the functions of the spinal cord and spinal nerves and how they help maintain homeostasis in the body. They're very important for that particular purpose. And then we'll lastly finish up talking about reflex arcs and kind of how reflex arcs are interesting in the fact that they kind of stay within kind of a very localized area. So reflexes are actually pretty cool. The functions of the spinal cord, again, to process reflexes, as we kind of just alluded to there, integrate EPSPs and IPSPs. Hopefully, if you were around and you watched the lectures for last week, EPSPs are excitatory, postsynaptic excitatory, postsynaptic potentials, and IPSPs are inhibitory. So it's inhibitory. And so this is basically the gas pedals and the brake pedals of your peripheral nervous system getting integrated into kind of the message that's going to be sent to the central nervous system. And so there's always kind of this interplay between excitation and inhibition. And so your body is always processing those inputs from whether one source or another. So we'll talk about part of that integration function of the spinal column, the spinal cord. And lastly, to conduct impulses to the brain, sensory impulses to the brain, and motor impulses to the effectors. So just think of sensory information kind of coming in, and then motor information kind of coming out. And we're going to actually look at cross sections of the spinal cord that are defined in this very specific section. So you're going to see there's a specific section where the information comes to the brain, and then you're going to see there's a different section of the spinal cord where information is going out into the body. And so it's very well organized in that regard. And it can be very specific. We hopefully will be getting into that level of specificity, knowing exactly what part of the spinal cord is correlating to what type of region of the body, but you can get down to that level of specificity if you're so interested. Okay, so spinal cord anatomy. So here you can see kind of a nice picture of a cadaver spinal cord. Now let's just point out some of the big things here. So first off, you have your bone. So your bone is going to be important kind of in terms of creating that structure that protects and kind of helps create structure for the spinal column to run against. And so here we can see we're looking at a transverse plane of a cervical column. So here you can see the head of that. And again, you have the space here. You can see the spinous process of the vertebra, and then kind of the different horns of that vertebra. And that one, that foramen that we saw earlier, we were talking about the bones of the spinal column. You can see that large gaping kind of region there, that foramen there. And then that's exactly where you have your spinal cord kind of flowing through. So your vertebra is going to be that bone that's outlined in red there. Next, we have the connective tissue, the meninges. And the meninges are kind of the coverings for the nervous system. And so we'll see that meninges cover not only the spinal cord, but they also have the same kind of orientation and organization in the brain as well. So when we look at this, you can see here that this covering is right around the outside of the spinal column. So the space between the bone and that covering is called the epidural space. And then next here you can see you have the pia mater, which is kind of very closely associated with the with that particular region. And then the dura and arachnoid matter or mater are going to be kind of a little bit more removed from the spinal column itself, but still kind of providing a protective layering. We talked about the blood-brain barrier. These coverings are kind of part of what creates a nice kind of cover for the nervous system. And so again, you've got the pia mater, which is kind of one region of the connective tissue, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Those are all three kind of different components to that connective tissue or the meninges, and we'll talk about that more in a second. And then lastly, I think, did I kind of allude to it here? So you'll see that in this region, kind of around between the spinal column and those mater regions, you're going to have kind of a space there, and that's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal is just kind of the name for this particular fluid. Sometimes it's annotated CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. So if you see that later on in the presentation, that's what it is. And this cerebrospinal fluid is just going to be kind of the fluid that bathes the spinal column, gives it all of its nutrients, all of the glucose that it requires for those neurons to stay happy and functioning, all of the ions that are required for those action potentials to fire kind of at the right rate. And so the CSF is very important. Also, just kind of something to worth note is that if someone is looking to maybe get a drug to the central nervous system, sometimes the CSF is a kind of a drug delivery system. So if you kind of puncture the CSF, it's one way to kind of break the blood-brain barrier, and so that way you can kind of have direct access to the CSF. And so one example of that would be something like an epidural. So if you're having a baby, you get an epidural, they're going to basically take some drugs and inject them right into your spinal column, and that's what's going to allow the deadening and the pain relief that you see in kind of the lower extremities of that individual. In terms of kind of all of these other, we talked about the spinous process, the subarachnoid space. The rest of this, again, if I didn't kind of highlight it or circle it, don't kind of get too worried about it. We're going to kind of talk about everything slowly but surely over the course of the presentation, but just recognize that you should be able to identify where the bone is, where the connective tissue is, and then where the fluid is located. Okay. So going back to what we just talked about, we talked about the meninges as being kind of the coverings of the spinal cord. And so here you can see the spinal cord itself. It's composed of gray matter and white matter. If we go back to think about what we learned about last chapter, we learned that white matter are myelinated axons and gray matter are cell bodies. And we're going to return to that several different times because we're going to be talking about the differences between gray matter and white matter for the spinal column. So when we look at this particular cross section, you can see kind of the most inner part here is the pia mater. The pia mater is going to be very tightly associated with the spinal column. It's going to be almost like a very tight sheath that encapsulates it. The next kind of sheath that covers the spinal column is the arachnoid mater. And the arachnoid mater actually looks, the reason it's called the arachnoid is because it kind of looks like a series of spider webs that encases the spinal column. Now, you might be thinking, oh, am I ever going to talk about this again? The answer is yes. This meningeal layers that we're talking about, these 1, 2, 3 meningeal layers we're talking about, are the same meningeal layers that we're going to see when we talk about the coverings of the brain. So it's definitely worth kind of noting that because we're going to revisit this here in following chapters. So your pia mater is kind of closest to the spinal column. Your arachnoid mater is kind of a spider-like net that encapsulates both the spinal column and the pia mater. And then kind of like the outermost covering there is the dura mater. It's a little bit more tough and protective than some of the other different layers, and just worth recognizing that some of these layers are going to have things like blood vessels or vasculature in them that help provide the brain, again, the oxygenation that it requires, or in this case, the spinal column, the oxygenation that it requires to function. So again, pia mater is the closest, arachnoid mater is kind of the middle layer, and then your most outermost layer is that dura mater, which is going to be kind of the rough and tough and most durable of those layers. And so this is just kind of a cutaway of each one of those layers that you see here. And so if you have any questions, please make sure that you're asking. Maybe some other words just kind of worth mentioning. You have your subarachnoid space, so it's going to be the space between the pia and the arachnoid, and then you have your subdural space, which is going to be the space between your dura and your arachnoid. And so just kind of recognize that there's different kind of layered spaces even between those layers, and those can be important to know as well. Okay, so the external anatomy of the spinal column. And so don't get overwhelmed by this particular figure because we're going to be breaking it down and talking about kind of each individual region slowly but surely. So we'll be talking about things like the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. It's just important to kind of, I guess, get the big view of these and just recognize that when we were learning all of the different kind of vertebra, the bones, the underlying, what's nice is there are underlying structures here that you can see kind of the same different, the same organization. So here you can see the cervical nerves kind of correlate to the same region of the cervical column. Here you see the thoracic nerves, again, correlate to the thoracic column. The lumbar nerves are going to correlate to the lumbar column, and then the sacral nerves are going to correlate to the sacral column. So again, you've kind of already learned the basic structure here, and we're just going to build off of that previous knowledge and then talk about different places that the nerves that originate in these regions, what they innervate. And when I say innervate, I mean what those nerves that are coming from the spinal column, what part of the body are they going to send signals to? And so it's important to just recognize that you've got a very organized spinal column where, your cervical nerves are going to be projecting into the regions of your upper body. And then, things like your sacral nerves are going to be, projecting to more inferior parts of your body. So it just, again, correlates very nicely in terms of the structure function of where the nerves are located and where they're sending their projections or innervating into the body. So I just want to make sure I kind of define that term innervating, because I throw it around a lot, but innervating is going to just be the term that you use for when nerves are being projected into a specific region. Okay, so the spinal column begins at the extension of the medulla oblongata at the level of the foramen and magnum, again, right there at the base of the skull. Remember when we were looking at the skull, that was that very large opening at the base there, and terminates at the level of L2. So if we kind of come all the way down here, you can see L2 right around here, those lumbar nerves, again, just kind of giving you an example of what the spinal column, again, that kind of terminates at that region. And then from there, you just have spinal, you have nerves that are being projected down lower from that region. Okay, so again, do not get overwhelmed by this particular figure. It has a lot of information on it, but we're just going to go through kind of the more important points. So probably worth noting difference between things like the white matter and the gray matter. And so this is just kind of nice because it shows you the very distinct color differences between those regions. Now, let's just go ahead and review again what the difference between white matter and gray matter are. So white matter are myelinated axons, meaning these are going to be projections that are being sent one way or the other, into or out of, away from the muscles or coming from the brain. Next, you have the gray matter, and these are all going to be essentially cell bodies for the most part. Obviously, you're going to have some axons projecting in there, but these are just a cluster of cell bodies. Those are going to be cell bodies. And so these cell bodies are going to be important for kind of mediating that interaction of signals being sent and signals being received from, the surrounding areas of the body. From there, you can see things like the spinal nerve and the dorsal root ganglion. Here you can see that. And again, just kind of showing how all of that information projects out into kind of the rest of the body. So this is kind of how that information is being sent out. Now, when we look at the dorsal root ganglion, here you can see what is exactly inside of that dorsal root ganglion. So this side kind of shows you, I think, a better example of that, exactly what how the neurons are distributed. So you've got the cell body of the sensory neuron. So for that dorsal root ganglion, you have sensory information coming into the cell. And maybe I should use a different color just to contrast it. So you have sensory information that is coming into the cell. And so the sensory information could be touch, could be pressure, could be a variety of things, and it's coming into the spinal column. And again, remember, this is where all of your cell bodies are going to be located here within your gray matter. And then you have what's called an interneuron that kind of acts as a relay neuron in terms of sending information to and from the other parts of the central nervous system. And then here you have the cell body of the motor neuron that is going to possibly cause some type of interaction or reaction that occurs. And again, this is kind of your output. And so in terms of the orientation of the spinal column, just recognize that essentially you've got one side that's an input and one side that's an output. And so it's important to kind of recognize those, as well as the difference between white and gray matter. Here you can see that there's also the cell body of an autonomic motor neuron. If we remember a little bit about what we learned about the autonomic system last chapter, those autonomic neurons are kind of the automatic functioning neurons within the nervous system. So outside of that, I guess we don't necessarily need to talk too much about things like the posterior rootlets, the median sulcus. The median sulcus is just kind of be the halfway point between the two different bilateral sides of this. This is your anterior white column on this side. Here's your posterior white column on this side. But again, I'm not going to get too much into like the anterior and posterior and things like that. Just make sure that you know the difference between gray and white matter, and then kind of how the, let's get the red out here, and then kind of the orientation that we see here of the sensory information coming in, and then the motor information coming out, and then the relay or the interneuron that's located here. That is going to be important to recognize, because we'll talk about that in terms of how messages get sent from the central or from the brain and integrated into motor movements. And then we'll also talk about kind of if you don't even send a projection up into the brain, what happens, AKA a reflex. Reflex just stays within the spinal column. It's kind of the cool part about it. Okay, so looking at another transverse plane, this is a cadaver transverse plane that you see here. And so kind of first thing that I pointed out on, or not the first thing, but something else I pointed out is that kind of that median sulcus that you see back here and your anterior median fissure. Again, that's kind of the middle region. You can see all of this white matter around the kind of the outside of the spinal cord. And then here you can see kind of all of that gray matter. If we break it down into posterior and anterior, recognize that this is your posterior here that correlates to both your gray horn and your white column. And then you have your anterior gray horn and your anterior white column. So just make sure you feel comfortable with those orientations. The gray commissure is just going to be kind of the part of the gray matter where you see the two sides kind of talking to one another, and then kind of located down the very middle of it, you have the central canal. So this is just, again, a great transverse image of the spinal column. And again, it's not a ton of information. It's primarily just pointing out gray and white matter and the difference between anterior and posterior. Okay, so in terms of sensory and motor processing, again, this is one of the main functions of the spinal cord, right? Is to essentially take sensory information in and then generate some type of motor response. And so the internal anatomy of that, again, lends itself to that function. So structure, function, right? That's kind of a huge tenet of anatomy and physiology we've hit upon multiple times. Okay, so again, you have, let's say, sensory receptors that are innervating parts of the skin. So you've got all of your skin that has pressure receptors and touch receptors and heat and thermal receptors, all of those things, right? So you've got those in the surface of your skin, and they're going to be sending information up here to your dorsal root ganglion. And then at that point, it's going to project here. And you kind of have it going into two different directions. You've got it going up the sensory ascending tract, and then you also have it synapsing onto another interneuron, and then ending up on a sensory ascending tract on kind of the other side. And so it just kind of depends on what the sensory receptor is for that. Here you have, again, an interneuron that plays kind of relay. So you've got sensory information coming in, and then once it's kind of synapses here, you can see that there's either a somatic neuron that is going to be sending information out into the muscle to respond. Now, just recognize that here at points when we're talking about the interneuron, there are other neurons that are kind of interacting there. And so here you can see the role of a motor descending tract. So ascending means that it's going up, and descending means that it's kind of coming down. And when I say coming up or being sent down, I'm basically talking about it coming or going from the CNS, aka the big guy upstairs, the brain. So you're sending information, sensory information up into like the sensory regions of your brain, it's being processed, and then you possibly have a motor response that's being sent back down. And so that's what's being sent down from those motor regions is going to be that descending track. And so you can see there that it's synapsing onto the neuron that's causing some type of motor response. And so that's just kind of important to recognize that you don't just have a single closed loop system where you've got sensory information going into your spinal column and then information being sent out. You also have to send it to the big head upstairs, the brain, right? Your brain has to take in that sensory information and also generate some type of motor response. So just recognize there that there's a few different types of interactions happening at these synapses. The other type of neuron that we talked about here was the autonomic motor neuron, and those are going to be synapsing onto more of your organs, causing those automatic types of responses happening. So your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and glands, things that we don't again consciously control or think about. Your autonomic nervous system is going to be very automatic, but it's still important to recognize that those nerves exist in your spinal column and are still being sent to those regions, and that autonomic motor neuron is also getting information from the big head upstairs, but we're not going to talk about that too much right now. Okay, so if you take transverse sections of the different regions of the spinal column, here you can kind of see the differences between the white and the gray matter. Again, depending on what part of the spinal cord you're looking at, it's going to vary the amounts of myelinated versus unmyelinated axons. And so here you can see the cervical kind of transverse section is that you have a ton of white matter, meaning that you have a ton of myelinated axons that are kind of sending out. And it makes sense because you're right here kind of at the top of the body. And so basically all of the information, right, that's going in or coming out, it's going to have to kind of come through that region. So you've got a ton of kind of it's like a super highway. It's almost like you don't want to bottleneck your super highway, right? You want to have a lot of room there for that information to be able to come in and go out. And so you've got a lot of white matter there. You've got a lot of myelinated axons sending information to the brain, and then also sending that information back down through the rest of the spinal column. So it's got a relatively large diameter, large segments of white matter that are oval. So you can see that here. The posterior great horn is large, but the anterior great horn is small. Again, I'm not going to ask you probably too much about the relative sizes of these. It's interesting because once you do get into like deep anatomy and physiology, you can actually kind of circle subregions of these and just literally talk about what part of the body they're going to in your ascending and descending tracks. So that's going to be kind of something fun to look forward to if you are going to become a physical therapist, for example. The thoracic spinal column, relatively small due to relatively small amounts of gray matter. So you don't have a ton of gray matter, except for the first thoracic segment, and then the anterior posterior horns are relatively small, and small lateral gray horn is present. So you can see kind of the distribution of the different cell bodies in that particular spinal cord. In the lumbar, you can see that you don't necessarily, again, have as many fiber tracks that are coming in, because at that point, right, you're not, that's kind of the beginning, I guess, of all of that information that's coming in. And so you don't have a ton of fiber tracks. So the fiber tracks are just going to be getting larger and larger as you kind of work your way up the spinal cord, again, because you're amassing more information from different regions. And so at your lumbar spinal cord, you actually have a ton of room for cell bodies at that region. So relatively less white matter than in cervical segments. And then it kind of talks about the distribution of the posterior and anterior gray horn. And then for your sacral, even smaller amounts of white matter and large amounts of gray matter. Coccygeal resembles the lower spinal segments, but not much smaller. So you can kind of see that as well there. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on talking about spinal nerves. So again, they're going to connect the CNS to sensory receptors. So again, the main function of the spinal column is to take all this information from our body and generate some type of response. Like obviously it's important for body homeostasis, as we saw with the autonomic nerves, but it also plays an important role in taking in sensory information and then outputting motor responses. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We'll kind of look at those. And the anterior and posterior roots attached to a spinal nerve to a spinal cord segment. And so again, this is kind of a fun verbal description, but I think the pictures are going to be a little bit more useful. If you are a visual person who likes videos, please make sure you click on this. Okay, so when we're looking at the connective tissue that covers spinal nerves, think of spinal curves as kind of being like bundles of axonal projections. And so if we break it down to kind of the simplest single unit here, you can see there's a single axon kind of as a small subunit of this. And then for going up there, going from there, you can see that every axon is going to have its own little myelin sheath. Again, myelin is so important in terms of increasing the rate of conductivity. But then you can see each one of those axons is kind of bundled together into a cluster of axons. And so the perineum that you can see here, they're going to be around a fascicle. This whole thing that you see here is that the whole bundle is called a fascicle, and the perineum is just kind of the covering around them, and the endoneurium is going to be around each individual axon. So the endoneurium is around each individual axon around the myelin sheath, and then the perineum is going to be around the entire fascicle. That fascicle, again, is going to be bundled into further kind of bundles. Here you can see the epineurium, and the spinal nerve is made up of several different kind of fascicles you can see joined here. It's important as we're kind of looking through this fascicle, if we look down this entire spinal nerve, you'll recognize that it's important that that is in fact oxygenated, so you have a blood vessel that's running down it. But again, you've got your single axon, your endoneurium, your perineurium, which encapsulates those fascicles. And then again, here's kind of a good example of a fascicle that you see here. Okay, so if we had talked about the organization of musculature, it actually would have looked a little bit similar to this. But you can, again, just kind of see the general organization of each spinal nerve with this particular figure. So if we take that spinal nerve and we kind of, again, continue to build on the levels of complexity and organization, and we do a transverse cross-section, this is a very similar cartoon as to when we looked at the very first, I think, image here, but that image was of a cadaver, and this is kind of, I think, a nice cartoon showing I think a more simplified version of this. So you have your bone, right? That first image we talked about how there's bone. So here you can see that bone. This is probably the worst possible color. So you have your bone, kind of, again, protecting your spinal, your your spinal nerve. And so here's your spinal cord. And so your spinal cord is running right down the middle of that foramen. And so if we look at both the dorsal and the body of the vertebra kind of being orientated, so you've got your dorsal posterior ramus here and your body of your vertebra down here. If we look kind of again in terms of levels of complexity, you've got your subarachnoid space that's just kind of located right inside of the arachnoid covering. So don't forget you have your dura, your arachnoid, and your pia mater that are all going to be encapsulating that spinal cord. And then projecting out from that spinal cord here, you can see the nerve connections. So these are called the rami communicantes. So these branches that it branches off of the spinal column are known as rami. So here you can see them branching off of the spinal cord. Again, either projecting out into muscles in most instances to allow for some type of somatic response. Okay, so when we talk about information kind of coming into the body and how it's processed and how it kind of is patterned across the body, what's really interesting is that it's so organized in the regions in which correlate to specific spinal nerves. So here you can see essentially each one of these colors is correlating to a different region or of the spinal cord. So here you have your cervical, here you have your thoracic, here you have your lumbar, and here you have your sacral. And so if you had, let's say, an infection or an issue, or let's say an injury at any one of these regions, you can very easily start to determine which region of the body would be affected by damage to that specific region of the spinal cord. So let's say if you did have a possible injury that affected just like the T8, this region here would be the region that is affected. If it is damage, of the entire tract, it might lead to damage from that region down or inferiorly. So just recognize, like I said, if you had an area of damage at T8, it would actually lead to possible damage if there was a severing of the spinal cord from there all the way down. But it is interesting to, again, to just recognize how this distribution of these sensory nerve impulses kind of lead to the brain, and how they're kind of expressed across the different regions. And so it's just super interesting because we can kind of look at them here. And then once we get to the brain, we can also map out exactly where these dermatomes are being projected to. Okay, so let's kind of start to work our way through the entire spinal cord. So let's start first with the cervical plexus. So this supplies skin and muscles of the head, neck, superior portions of the shoulders, and chest and diaphragm. So here you can basically see C1 through C5. We'll talk about the brachial plexus here in following slides. And then you'll recognize here that there are some other nerves that maybe we haven't talked about yet. You'll see numbers related to specific nerves. Those are called the cranial nerves. Those are nerves that are innervating usually the face and upper neck, things like the tongue, nerves that are important for mastication. We talked about this a lot when we were talking about some of the musculature in those regions. But you can see here that C1 through C5, again, is going to innervate things like the lesser optical, the transverse cervical, superior root of the ansa cervicalis, the inferior root of the ansa cervicalis, and then the supraclavicular, and as well as the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve, if you remember, innervates a very important muscle that we use every day, multiple times a day, aka your diaphragm. So your phrenic nerve actually connects to your diaphragm and makes sure that you consistently are breathing, which is important, right? Okay, so these here in terms of the superficial or sensory branches, here you can see that the C2 is the lesser optical. It's found in the skin of the scalp of the posterior and superior ear. Your C2 to C3 is your greater auricular, and that's distributing to your skin, anterior, inferior, and over ear and over parotoid glands. And then your transverse cervical, the origin is from C2 to C3, and that's over the anterior and lateral aspect of your neck. And then your supraclavicular, which is located at your C3 and C4, is the skin over the superior portion of your chest and your shoulder. So just recognize here, kind of as you work your way down those cervical nerves, you're kind of hitting those different kind of dermatomes across kind of the lower face as well as the upper shoulder. Okay, so moving down from the cervical to the brachial plexus, which again, we kind of pointed out was part of the cervical projections that we saw there. So the brachial plexus is just kind of the region in which you're going to see innervation from the cervical spinal cord into the regions that affect the shoulder and upper limbs. And so here you can see C4 through essentially C8 and even T1. You're going to be innervating things like your superior trunk, your middle trunk, and then your inferior trunk. So those first kind of nerves that you see there are very important for kind of the trunk-ish area of the body. I'm not going to ask you again to get kind of down to this level of detail that we're seeing out here in terms of the brachial plexus. I think in terms of level of resolution, I'll just be asking you about things like the superior middle trunk and the inferior trunk. We don't necessarily need to get down to specific regions, I guess, of the brachial plexus. If you are so inclined to learn that, please do, especially if you're going forward into physical therapy. You're probably doing yourself a favor if you start to memorize that now. So this is, again, kind of getting down to a level of projection that maybe, or detail that I'm not going to ask you to know, but I'm going to show you here anyways. Again, the innervation for the brachial plexus is in regions C4 through T1, and then you can kind of see the dorsal scapular nerve, the nerve to the subclavius, the suprascapular nerve, all kind of projecting off of those particular root bodies into the parts of the upper arm and even lower arm to allow for movement of the musculature in those regions. And so just recognize that these are all This is all kind of important information in terms of understanding kind of how the spinal cord interacts with this region. But again, I'm not going to ask you to kind of get down to the level of understanding where is the ulnar nerve, the radial nerve, or the median nerve. I just don't think we're to that level of resolution in this particular course. Okay. So in terms of what types of movements are mediated by the brachial plexus, here you can see some examples of the types of movements would be things like the wrist drop or the median nerve palsy. So if you have damage to the brachial plexus, it's going to lead to this type of palsy or shaking. Ulnar palsy or winging of the right scapula. Again, if you have damage to this region, it's going to lead to kind of misfunction in the musculature of that region and in your ability to kind of have smooth movements and uniform movements across those regions. And so these different types of palsies, again, would be shaking or malformation or dysregulation of the muscular to those regions. Okay. So not going to necessarily get you down into this level of memorization, but just I'm going to quickly point out that in terms of the brachial plexus, you do have nerves that are originating in your C5 through C8, and this is essentially giving you the list of names for that region as well as the distribution. And luckily, since we just finished up muscles, all of these particular muscles should be fairly fairly what am I saying, very clear in your mind, right? We just went over all this, so you should be very clear about where the serratus anterior is, things like the pectoralis major. And so you can see that luckily many of the nerves that innervate those regions are very closely named, but I'm not going to ask you about those specific nerves for things like the brachial plexus. I'm just kind of, again, to continue down the different regions. You've got your axillary, your median, your radial nerves that are going to innervate things like your deltoid, your flexors of your forearms, and your triceps brachii. For your medial pectoral, your medial cutaneous nerve of arm, and then your medial cutaneous nerve of forearm, you can see again, you're still kind of working your way down from superior to inferior of the body. So this would be your pectoralis major and minor, skin of the skin of medial and posterior aspects of the distal third of arm, and then the skin of the medial and posterior aspects of the forearm, as well as the flexor carpi ulnaris. Again, these are all different regions that we've talked about extensively in the past, and this kind of gives you a general understanding of the nerves that are innervating those regions or those muscles that we've talked about. Okay, so we've kind of worked our way through the cervical region, a little bit through the thoracic, and now let's talk a little bit about the lumbar plexus. Not surprising, the lumbar plexus are going to be very important in projecting into the lower regions of the body. And so here you can kind of see L1 through L5 are going to be projecting into different regions of the lower limb, things like the iliohypogastric, the iliolingual, the genitofemoral, the lateral cutaneous of the nerve of the thigh, your femoral artery, or not artery, your femoral nerve, and then lastly, your arbitrator. And recognize you have both your anterior and posterior division, as well as the roots that you see here kind of annotated in yellow. So if we look at what this actually looks like in the lower limb and where these projections are being sent to, so here you can see the iliohypogastric nerve kind of coming off into the hip region, right? And then if you kind of go down to the L2, L3, and L4 region, here you see the iliolingual nerve, part of kind of an extension off of that. And then as well as your genitofemoral nerve, kind of located in this region here. And then kind of your lateral cutaneous nerve of the thigh, located in this region here. Your arbitrator nerve, you can see located in this region as well. And your femoral nerve, which you can see kind of lining the front part of your thigh. It's just important to kind of recognize we're looking at both the anterior and posterior view here. You can see some of the nerves are slightly different. You've got a superior to the gluteal nerve, inferior gluteal nerve, and then nerve to the quadratus femoris and inferior gemellus, and then nerve to the arbitrator internus and superior gemellus. Again, these are all musculature that we've talked about in the past. So I guess as we're going through these nerve projections, hopefully you're getting kind of a clear image in your mind as to which of these nerves are innervating which muscles and kind of what the effect would be if you had damage at any of these locations. Okay, so the iliohypogastric to L1 is going to be, again, that anterior lateral abdominal wall, your iliolingualis muscles of the anterior lateral abdominal wall and skin of upper medial aspect of the thigh. The generofemoral, the skin over the middle anterior surface of the thigh, scrotum in male, and the labia majora in female. And then the lateral cutaneous nerve of thigh, which is the skin over the lateral anterior and posterior aspects of the thigh. Just recognize that as we go through this, we're kind of going from kind of L1 to L2 and L3, working our way through those different innervations. Femoral, the femoral nerve, again, very important. It's the largest nerve rising from the lumbar plexus, and it's important for the flexor muscles of the hip joint and knee joint. So this is kind of a fairly large nerve bundle that you see there. And lastly, you can see the arbitrator, which is the adductor muscles of the hip joint and skin over the medial aspects of the thigh. So you can see both some of the muscles as well as some of the skin regions that are getting innervated from these regions. Lastly, we're kind of, again, working your way from cervical to thoracic, lumbar. Lastly, we've got our sacral plexus. So here you can see that bundle of nerves kind of contributing to that gluteal region. So kind of S1 through S5 will also kind of include L1, L4, and L5 in there as well. So here you can see your superior gluteal, your inferior gluteal, nerve to piriformis, and your tibial, as well as your sciatic. Sciatic nerve is probably a nerve you've heard of multiple times. It's one of those nerves that kind of tends to get damaged or pinched and can lead to some pretty excruciating lower back pain for individuals. And so again, you're kind of putting together that idea of recognizing you're learning something in class maybe you've heard of before. Okay, so here we can see kind of the projections of those nerves that we just talked about from the sacral plexus. So you have, again, coming from your L4, L5, and then you have your cervical nerves also located down here. So your superior gluteal nerve, your inferior gluteal nerve, your nerve to your quadratus femoris, as well as your nerve to your arbitrator femoris, all kind of located here in the posterior view of this. It's a little difficult to see, so I might want to, if you get a chance to, on your PowerPoint, maybe bring this up so you can get a higher level of resolution. But then you can also see down here things like your tibial nerve, your common fibular nerve, important for innervating those regions next to those specific bones. Tibial nerve, your medial plantar nerve, and your lateral plantar nerve, those plantar nerves are going to be important for innervating and mediating motions of the foot. Okay, so the sacral plexus, we talked about the superior gluteal, the inferior gluteal, the nerve to the piriformis, nerve to the quadratus femoris, and the nerve to the arbitrator internus, as well as the perforating cutaneous. Again, this origin going from L4 all the way down to S3, hitting most of those of the muscles and regions of the lower half of the lower half of the body, things like your glutamus, your piriformis, your quadratus femoris, your arbitrator internus, as well as the skin over the medial aspect of the buttock is hit by some of these nerves. The posterior cutaneous nerve of the thigh, your pudendal, as well as your sciatic. Again, your sciatic nerve is probably something worth mentioning because it is a type of nerve or nerve damage that can lead to quite excruciating pain. So it's actually two nerves, the tibial and the common fibular, bound together by a common sheath of connective tissue and splits into two divisions. It can, as a sciatic nerve descends through the thigh, it sends branches to the hamstring muscles and adductor magnus. So it can, again, if there is any type of sciatic pinching or damage, can cause pain to those regions. The last image that we looked at, we did point out the tibial as well as the medial plantar and the lateral plantar and how important those are to those lower extremity muscles. So thing like you would think of more like your calf muscle, I guess your gastrocnemius, your plantar soleus, tibialis posterior, basically all of those muscles in that general region, as well as the muscles that are important for flexion in your feet. So your medial plantar and your lateral plantar are going to be innervating those regions for foot movement. So we talked about your tibial, your fibular nerves, your superficial fibular, so your fibularis longus and brevis, your deep fibular, tibular anterior, extensor longus. Again, all part of the nerves for the sacral plexus. So I hope you're not getting inundated with kind of information here. I'm not going to take it down to this level of like, where does this nerve innervate which of these muscles? There might be a handful of those I'll ask you to know, but definitely not all of them. Okay, so spinal cord physiology. So in order to maintain homeostasis, it has to be able to propagate and integrate information, right? You have to be able to send information up into the brain and also integrate that information and have it return back down into your somatic nervous system or your muscles. So how does information travel in the spinal cord? So first you have the white matter tracts that conduct nerve muscles to and from the brain. And then you have your gray matter that receives and integrates incoming and outgoing information to perform spinal reflexes. So if we think of kind of the prototypical spinal cord, kind of what it looks like, again, you've got all these regions that you've got these white matter tracts that are going to and from the brain. And then you've got these cell bodies that are located in this gray matter that are essentially telling the rest of the integrating the information that's being sent from the sensory information out back into the motor, but then also interacting with these fiber tracts that are going to and from the brain as well. So just again, make sure you feel very comfortable describing the differences between white matter and gray matter, and then the integration role that they play to and from the brain as well. Okay, so as I kind of alluded to before, if you get into like hardcore physical therapy, you can actually start to break down each individual fiber track, and it will tell you where it's going and where it's come from. So what's nice though is that here you can see the different regions broken down into very clear blue and red regions, and the blue are going to be your sensory, or what are called your ascending tracks, and then your motor are going to be your descending tracks that are coming from the brain and sending information to your muscles. And so this is just kind of a nice example of some of those different tracks. Basically, this is telling you this is the posterior spinal cerebral tract. This is a lateral spinal thalamic tract. This is, and that's these are ascending tracts that are going up into the brain. Here you've got your cortical spinal tract coming from the brain down into those regions. And so I'm not going to ask you about these specific regions here, just because we're, again, not going to get down into that level of specificity. I think the takeaway point from this slide is that you've got sensory motor tracts that are ascending, and then motor tracts that are descending. And then we'll talk kind of about the orientation of them. Okay, so I kind of alluded to the fact that reflexes are also kind of part of the function of the spinal cord. And this is actually pretty cool because in the case of reflexes, you don't have any interaction with the information going to the brain. It basically stays in kind of a closed loop system where you have your sensory information coming into the spinal cord deciding how to respond, and that response kind of going back out into that musculature. So it's very fast. It's involuntary, meaning that you have no cognitive processing capabilities over it. It's unplanned, again, because you can't cognitively process it in any way. But it does helps maintain homeostasis. They're evolutionarily advantageous in some ways. Think of like if you touch something hot, your response is such a fast reflex that you don't even have time to think about it to kind of like save your hand. The gray matter of the spinal cord serves as an integrating center, so that center, that gray matter there where those cell bodies are, integrates the message and sends it right back out to the muscles. So let's look at some examples of this. Okay, so reflexes, super fun. Here you can see the general components of a reflex arc. So you've got first your sensory receptor. So in this case, we're just going to be like a receptor that detects pain. So you've got maybe you stepped on a tack or you put your hand on a tack, and you've got this information that's coming from the sensory receptor to your gray matter that you see here. You have an interneuron that integrates that information and automatically causes a response out through that descending track of the motor neuron. So you literally have sensory receptor, perceives something, goes to the spinal column, automatically sends information out into that effector system to tell it, say, hey, move your behind away from that sharp object. So if you touched a tack, let's say, your immediate response to pull away didn't even go to your brain, just to your spinal cord, right back out to your hand to pull your hand away from that. Okay, so reflex arcs, so vocabulary terms. So you can have ipsilateral, a contralateral, a monosynaptic, a polysynaptic, or reciprocal innervation. So we'll talk about each one of these in the following slides. If just really quickly, ipsilateral and contralateral, that's kind of talking about kind of sides of the effects of those reflexes. Monosynaptic and polysynaptic mean the number of synapses that are required in order for this reflex to take place. And then reciprocal innervation is kind of the innervation of other nerves into the process. And so let's start by looking at the stretch reflex. And so here for the stretch reflex, you have your stretching stimulates the sensory receptor that you see here that's located within the muscles. And so the sensory neuron gets excited, goes up here to the dorsal root ganglion. Again, you have the information that does get sent to the brain that it's kind of perceiving that this is happening, but the response is so quick that it's not mediating any kind of downward response. So you have it projecting onto this inhibitory interneuron as well as this other neuron. Again, you've got a positive and kind of a negative gas and brake that happens here. And so you have your, in the case of your stimuli again being that maybe knocking against your knee, that stretch reflex there, you have this set of muscles that's going to get activated, and then you have this set of muscles that's going to be essentially relaxed in that. And so that's why you see both the activating neuron as well as the inhibitory neuron. The inhibitory neuron is going to relax those muscles that are kind of contralateral to the muscles that need to flex, which are going to be on the top of the thigh there. So this is a stretch reflex is causing a contraction of a muscle that has been stretched. And so this is kind of that knee-jerk reaction, I think, that most folks think of when they think about reflexes. Okay, the tendon reflex. Here you can see this causes relaxation of the muscle attached to the stimulated neuron. So here you can see kind of the first step here is the increased tension of the stimulated sensory neuron of the tendon. And so the next step is that sensory neuron is kind of recognizing that it's excited. And so you have activation of two interneurons that you see here, one of them positive and one of them negative. And so during this integration center, the sensory neuron activates the inhibitory neuron. So you can see both the activation of the antagonistic muscles that are going to contract, and then you have kind of your muscles that are attached to the same tendon that are going to relieve any of the excess tension. So this is part of just kind of the tendon reflex of that as well. The crossed extensor reflex, it's going to essentially maintain balance during withdrawal reflex. And so if you pull away very quickly from something, your body needs to be able to compensate that with some type of reflex. And so what's interesting here is we've kind of got three different kind of neuronal interactions that are occurring. So kind of as we look up the ascending interneurons, again, this is kind of a transverse section of these. So as you look, you've got your stepping on attack, your sensory neuron gets excited. It sends information to this kind of one slice or transverse slice of the spinal cord, and that's going to lead to activation of these flexor muscles and contract within the jaw of the right leg. Now, what's interesting is as you have that contraction of the right leg, you need to have balance, kind of maintaining balance in the opposite leg. And so because of that, you've also have projections going across that those dorsal horns into the other side, and that's going to project onto the opposite leg. And so here you have effectors and extensors that are going to cause extension of that other leg. You recognize that it's just causing activation not just in this one slice of the spinal cord, but you're also seeing activation in both the ascending, kind of descending interneurons as well. Again, to kind of to allow for greater flexion regions of that particular set of muscles. You want to make sure that you're not just activating a single kind of set of fibers or clusters of muscles. You want to make sure that you're getting enough musculature activated that it can maintain both flexion as well as relaxation and stabilization of the body. Okay, so I think I'm going to just briefly mention this here and then probably come back. And while we're talking about this on class on Thursday, we're going to kind of have an expanded explanation of some of the disorders that can occur through damage of the spinal column. One student kind of mentioned that they had worked with individuals who had traumatic injuries to their spinal column. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But traumatic injuries can be one disorder of the spinal column, I guess. The monoplegia, paraplegia, hemiplegia, quadriplegia, again, depending on where the damage occurs within the spinal cord. So the degree the damage is going to the damage that results from the traumatic injury depends on the degree of the spinal cord section, and then also the degree of compression of the segments involved. So where the segments are involved and how much compression actually occurred, and if it was a complete severance or if it was just kind of a slight perturbation to that particular region. You can also have things like spinal cord compression, which we kind of alluded before, that can occur whether or not you have that traumatic injury. Degenerative diseases, and so we talked a lot about the importance of myelination for sending and receiving information. So think of what would happen if you had demyelination of the axons that project into your skeletal system or send information up, and that's essentially the case of multiple sclerosis. And then shingles is going to be an infection of the spinal nerves. And what's interesting about shingles, it's kind of like it looks a little bit like chickenpox, or it's a kind of a variant of chickenpox, and it has a very, what they call tototopic. I mean, when we looked at this as desmosomes, if you can actually map out which individual kind of section of the spinal column maybe was infected by the distribution of rash on that person's body, which is kind of interesting. Poliomyelitis, again, just kind of an interesting disorder that affects overall function of the spinal column. So I think that's ultimately all I have for you today for chapter 13. Like I said, in lecture on Thursday, we'll kind of do an expansion on the quadriplegia and discuss that a little bit more, what that kind of looks like and what the effects are. Hopefully throughout this particular lecture, you were able to answer all of your study guide questions. If you do have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. I'm not going to be asking you about individual spinal projections into specific regions, so that level of memorization just isn't going to be there. This is going to be kind of more of a 30,000-foot view of the spinal column, just thinking about kind of how it functions in the big picture, not necessarily individual dorsal roots and kind of where they're going and coming. So hopefully, yeah, everyone has a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Thank you all so much.